Good evening. You know who I am by now. This is going to be a discussion with Gregory Sadler, who is a professional philosopher. He started a business outside of the academy using philosophy as something that's helpful for people's personal and professional lives. We have really long discussion. I contacted him because I ended up going to his YouTube channel quite a bit whenever I am interested in philosophy or different thinkers. He pops up, I go through, I listen to his stuff. He forms a great kind of a portal to these different thinkers. And so I was surprised that he'd want to even talk to me. So we have this great conversation. Well, I hope it's great for you. In the description, there are links to his YouTube channel and to his various other philosophical endeavors. He does have a free speculative fiction through the lens of philosophy course, and I'll link that below. It's fascinating if you guys are into speculative fiction and philosophy. I mean, what is speculative fiction but philosophy mashed with, literature? So there's a great course. It's totally free. You guys can peruse that, and I hope that you guys get as much out of this conversation as I did. You have experience in teaching philosophy in institutions, as well as you're running a business now where you use philosophy as training, as therapy, and then you have multiple different courses where through YouTube and other websites you're being an independent scholar at this point. So that's a unique position for a philosopher nowadays.
Sort of. There's quite a few people out there doing it, in part because the job market is so terrible. There's a lot of people working as consultants, working in other parts of academia as well. And I think there's now a growing movement of people who either went on and did graduate work and maybe finished their PhD and are no longer buying into if you don't get yourself a tenure track position, you somehow failed. Which is what the most of the professors tend to put across, and it's really bad for the poor students who are coming up. I mean, even in my time, so I graduated in 2002, okay. And the job market was pretty bad back then, and it's very stratified. They don't tell you this, but who you know and where you went to plays a much greater role than whether you have any talent or even decent publications. Yeah. And that's the way it is in academia. And it's that way in philosophy, it's that way in the humanities, it's that way even in the sciences. And so there's this kind of class system involved with it. And if you are benefiting from it, well, then, you're probably not going to call it into question. You think everything's a meritocracy. Totally not the case at all. And so, we didn't really know this at SIU because it's a lower tier school. Those of us who could have gone to other places were mostly first generation college, and our mentors didn't prepare us for the job market at all. But now it's getting better. At least some of the people who are like my age, I'm 47, they're starting to give better advice to the graduate students about maybe looking for work elsewhere. But a lot of them are also caught up in that, if you don't get yourself a tenure track job or just keep chasing after them, you're a loser. And it's very debilitating to the poor graduate students.
That shapes your thought too. I mean, as a thinker, you don't have a lot of freedom to try out new ideas and to really risk being wrong if it's all career-based.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of jumping onto trends, both in philosophy, and we can talk more about the other humanities, but in philosophy, it's largely analytic philosophy or continental philosophy. And in analytic philosophy, it's very trend-based, and most of the people working in different parts of it no longer really talk to each other. So we're now in what they'll describe as a post-analytic framework. You can't rely on everybody having the same common vocabulary. Yeah. There's a common methodology, but it's not very well defined. And then in continental philosophy, people are all over the map. You've got some really serious scholarship on say, hermeneutics or phenomenology. And then you've got weird flaky stuff all over the place as well, and everything in between. And so there's a good bit of trendiness involved in that. And then there's people who do, more serious history of philosophy.
Yeah.
They think that it's worth, say, studying Aristotle, not just so that you can push him into, some analytic categories and talk about, is he an internalist or externalist or some thing like that, but actually to study Aristotle's texts and think through the world that way, or study the Stoics or study Descartes in that way. And you can study continental thinkers that way too. So there's a little bit of a closer connection between good continental philosophy and solid history of philosophy. And then there's other things going on. There's a classical American tradition in philosophy. I was lucky to get exposed to that. There's of course a lot of Christian thought as well. Sort of at the borders between philosophy and theology, and there's comparative philosophy, and so the field is quite wide. But there is that tendency to jump onto, this is going to get me notoriety, hired.
Yeah.
This is the vocabulary I need, and it's kind of anti-philosophical if you think about things in the broad scope. But if all of your mentors are saying this is really important for you to do for job development, well, you're unless you are an independent thinker, you're gonna follow that.
Yeah, I wonder what Plato would have to say about that, and how power has crept into, or social pressure has crept into, the act of thinking about the good life, or thinking about metaphysics. And
yeah, well, I mean, he'd have a huge culture shock to get over to begin with. Right? But then, let's say you took him through, I don't know, it's probably taken a year or two to adjust. He would say that I mean, he was saying this in his own time, not to put a fine point on it. And he doesn't say it in these words, but he's saying essentially most of what counts as philosophy out there in my own time is bullshit. Mm-hmm. It's these people going around and claiming that they're doing it. They're also claiming to teach everything else under the sun, or at least they're honest, like Gorgias, and they just say, I just teach rhetoric, that's all I do. But most of them are claiming to teach just about everything, and they're not particularly good at it, And so if Plato were around today, I think he'd probably be fairly critical, but he'd be critical across the board. He'd look at analytic philosophy and he'd say, well, they talk a lot about rigor and arguments, but I don't think most of these people really understand what those terms mean. And he'd think about what it'd be like for Plato to assimilate the history of philosophy.
Yeah, that's true.
From him on, he'd probably be pretty excited about that.
So how does working outside of the academy affect your? Well, because it's still a business, so you need to take your body of knowledge and then adapt it to a customer base and make it practical. And so you're picking and choosing, but I'm sure there's other pressures going on with you to go in different directions. I see you do kind of a long-running course on speculative fiction.
A series,
a series on speculative.
And I have created a free online course, basically as a way that people can get the resources. That's the series I deliver face to face here in the Milwaukee area.
Oh, okay, like at cafes, or like you have a classroom?
No, we partnered with a local library, so we meet there monthly, and it's one of their book clubs. And it's in its third year now. Probably it'll go on for a long time. And there's like a core of people who show up to it. Every once in a while we get somebody new. But the viewers online, they're very interested in it too, and they can't directly participate. So I created that course as a way that they can get into it.
Yeah. When did you start doing the YouTube thing?
Oh, so I started doing that while I was still a full-time professor at Fayetteville State University. But I wasn't really, so I'd say there were like three phases. There was the initial adopting phase, and my at that time fiance, now wife, was the one who really got me into it. She was suggesting to me that I should start video recording my lectures and playing around with it. So she got me a flip cam, and we got a little tripod, and I started recording these lectures. And back then, YouTube First, it was like only 10-minute long, and then 15, then 20-minute long
Yeah.
videos. So you couldn't really upload that much. So I was working with the institution. We'd put it into the Fayetteville State University's channel, which is where those course videos on critical thinking still are. And I was very skeptical. I'm not politically conservative. I don't actually fit into the spectrum very well, but I'm sort of temperamentally conservative. People, give me an idea, and I'm like, that's never going to work, right? So, and my wife is the opposite. She's an early adopter, and so she was like, just try it out. And I was like, who's going to watch this? I'm a nobody, teaching at a very low tier institution, but within like about 2 weeks of posting those videos, they were getting thousands of views and lots of comments. And the comments were the most interesting part, because people were saying things like, thank you for posting this. My instructor won't explain anything. I don't understand what they're trying to convey. Our textbook is awful. This is really helpful. And by this time, too, you got to remember, I'd been teaching for a good 10 years. A little bit longer than that. So I'd gone through the learning curve involved in how to make, complex ideas manageable for students. So if I was doing it straight out of grad school, maybe it wouldn't have been very good. And so that gave me the impetus to start doing these Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talk lectures.
Yeah. I love those.
Yeah, because, everybody at the time, it's still going on now. Everyone's proclaiming every, month or so, the lecture is dead,
Right.
It's a terrible way to deliver content. And I agree that most lecturers are terrible lecturers. Most college professors aren't very good at that, including communications professors. They're sometimes the worst, because they think that they know what they're doing,
Yeah.
But
it's got to be a tried and true critique
to.
I see this pop up a lot, where people start to blame the form because they can't master it. Like the novel's dead, or like the lecture's dead. It's like, well, can you make it alive? Like, that's the question.
And the stuff that they're always opposing to it, some of it's worth looking into. This active learning stuff. Some of it's pretty cool, but I find that if you incorporate too much of that, the students after a while are like, this is really fun. We're doing all this great stuff. When are you actually going to talk to us about what you had us read? Because we're paying you as the expert to convey something to us. You don't have to lecture reading from, a page or something for an hour at a time. My lectures are very interactive, but you actually, if you're the expert, you should in fact be getting across expertise.
Yes, exactly.
Not just having focus groups.
Well, your work, and this is why I contacted you, and why I'm surprised that you reached back to me, because you're a paragon of like what YouTube can be, or what interactive internet content can be. Like the skill that you bring to it and the engagement, it's just a great resource that you're putting up there that's free, and then through the YouTube model and crowdsourcing and then other things, you can start to support yourself. So did you see when you were thinking about leaving the academy that this would be a path for you, or?
No, as a matter of fact, I left not because I had to, or even really wanted to, but I left for love. My fiance at the time was up in New York, and she was working at the Culinary Institute of America. I was down in North Carolina, and she and I knew each other since high school, and we'd connected up a couple times since then, and then fell in love and decided we wanted to make a life together. And so for about a year and a half, we did this long distance relationship thing where I would once a month drive up to Raleigh, catch a plane to JFK.
Oh, wow.
She would drive down 2 hours. If traffic was good, to pick me up. We'd drive back up 2 hours and then spend, the weekend together. And on Sunday night, we'd do the whole thing in reverse.
Wow.
And it was really killing us. So we decided, I was actually up for early tenure and promotion. I had my dossier all prepared. I just finished defending the quality enhancement plan to the accreditors. FSU was going through a 10-year accreditation under SACS, and SACS makes every other accreditation body look like a bunch of wimps.
Oh, really?
SACS is very, very tough. So I was in line I was already running university-wide assessment for FSU at the time, and I'd started a ethics and business education initiative. So if I would have stayed there, I was already starting to move up into administration. And I left that all behind to move up with my wife, so we could actually, be in the same place and see each other more than once a month, other than through Skype. So then I, just sent out query letters to the local colleges, and Marist got back to me. And I thought what I would do probably is just, adjunct and do some writing and work on some book projects, and then do, the video stuff on the side. But I started recording my class lectures because Marist was, pretty cool about intellectual property stuff. Those took off. And then it just, sort of one thing led to another. I was actually talking with somebody earlier today who was trying to start a business, and he wanted to know how I'd planned out all these different things that I'm doing. And I said, well, I didn't really plan them out. A lot of them kind of happened, and then I would think about what I was doing and start doing a bit of planning afterwards, which is not the way to do things.
Well, unless that's how things happen.
Yeah, and the YouTube stuff has been good because I don't do a lot of marketing for my tutorial services, philosophical counseling and coaching, consulting, those sorts of things. Most of it comes to me with people contacting me and saying, hey, I want to study this. And I'll say, well, here's my rates, or do you think that you can do something with respect to this? Or do you want to come and talk about this? And most of the time the answer is yes. And it's good because then I learn a lot of things in the process.
Yeah, like you're kind of given these assignments, and then you shuffle your attention in that direction.
Yeah, and I'll tell you one thing too. So I never thought I would be doing entrepreneurial stuff. Since I've been doing it, the only way that I would consider going back and taking a full-time academic position, it would have to be like a totally, tailor-made chair or something like that, because I've become very impatient with dealing with administrative nonsense. I'll still teach. Like I taught 2 classes from Marquette last semester, which is just down the road, and they had a real need. They needed somebody to come in. They called me up a week and a half before classes began and said, we have 2 sections of ethics. We need them taught. Can you do it? And I said, yeah, okay. It's sort of a staple class for me. But seeing, when you go back into an academic institution, you do all the in-processing, and you see, all the sort of backroom stuff that goes on, and think about how long it would take to actually like propose a new class.
Yeah.
Probably 2 years. Or all the ways in which your hands are tied for this and this and this.
Yeah.
It's just, it's not my thing anymore.
So I guess the negative side of that is that without an institution, you can't necessarily give somebody a degree. So you can't like give people credit.
Exactly, yeah.
You just give them knowledge.
Yeah, and people are willing to, there's an incredible hunger out there on the part of ordinary people, especially working professionals, for the kind of knowledge that the humanities ought to be delivering. And the universities are in general doing a terrible job with it, both in sort of planning and in how most classes are set up and structured. And they're also charging an arm and a leg for it too. It doesn't have to be quite so expensive because we don't need so many parasitical administrators or fancy buildings or things like that. So there's that, and then our regular sort of culture stuff. If you think about television, radio, even having like NPR stations, they're not doing a very good job either. They're so selective in what they're interested in talking about, and quite often they're coming from these academic backgrounds that make it hard for them to relate to ordinary people as well.
Wow, yeah.
And so there's this immense market out there that's just not being tapped. And the way that you have to get into it is by being accessible to people.
Yeah.
You know, if you're talking down to them as the typical professor inevitably does, then you're going to turn them off, and they're going to be like, well, I guess that's not for me, you know, because some of these people are laboring under the impression that they're dumb, you know, because somebody told them they were dumb, or they weren't very good, you know. When they took their intro to philosophy class, the instructor was some fresh out of grad school jerk or some burnt out tenured professor who presented the stuff in an inaccessible way and then blamed the students. So, you know, a lot of people, they don't realize that, hey, they can study philosophy on their own or with, you know, a guide like me, and they can make good progress. And when they find that out, they're less interested in the credentialing, and they're much more interested in having the knowledge. I think that's part of why, you know, the modern Stoicism movement that I'm part of, although I'm not actually a Stoic, because I'm an eclectic, that's part of why they're taking off, because again, they don't talk down to people, you know, they actually connect with people.
Is there something, do you think that there's something that you could say is capturing people about Stoicism, or why that's appealing in this day and age or in this culture?
Well, yeah, there's a couple features, and this is part of why I got into the modern Stoic movement. When they asked me to, like, you know, become editor of Stoicism Today, largely because I'd had some editorial experience already, I said sure. I wanted to study what they're doing, what their best practices, so I can apply them to, say, Aristotelian philosophy, you know, or later Platonic philosophy, which are not catching on like wildfire. In part because the people who are studying it just are not able to connect it with ordinary people.
Okay.
Even though we've got great thinkers out there like MacIntyre, you know, who can connect with ordinary people. Who did a lot of consulting in his own day and talks constantly about the need to connect with plain people. So yeah, the modern Stoic movement, well, part of it is that you can read your way through the corpus of classic Stoic texts fairly quickly. So you've got Seneca, you know, you've got these letters, and then there's a couple treatises that are really important. Then you've got Epictetus with the Enchiridion and the Discourses. And then you've got Marcus Aurelius. And you can read other stuff, too. There's some great stuff in Cicero. You've got, you know, Arius Didymus, his Epitome, and we've got these fragments from this guy Heracles. But, you know, you could read your way through all the Stoic stuff in one semester and really study it intensively. So that, I think, helps, you know. Sort of like if you're studying Descartes, Harry Frankfurt, who's a great, you know, 20th century, and he lived into the 21st century philosopher, who I think most people know from his On Bullshit book, right?
Okay, yeah.
He was actually a good Descartes scholar, and he said that the reason he got into Descartes is he was lazy. He was deciding who to focus on, so he picked somebody who had a fairly small corpus. Yeah. You know? Not like Aristotle, right, or Thomas Aquinas, or Immanuel Kant. Descartes you can read fairly easily. So I think that's part of it. I think that the fact that the people involved in the organizing have not been afraid to interact with ordinary people, and that there are connections between, say, Stoicism and rational emotive behavior therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, that helps out quite a bit.
Is there like some sort of built-in humility with Stoicism and communication, and like how you communicate?
You would
pair
think
everything?
so.
Oh, okay.
Right?
I don't know.
I mean, yeah, there should be. And if you're reading the Stoic texts and taking them seriously, you shouldn't be a jerk. But if you go on to like the Stoic discussion forums, a lot of people have not managed to get that message, and they have to be kicked off every so often.
Oh, really? Okay.
Right? Yeah, it's like with anything else. I mean,
yeah.
You can look at Christians and how many of them are actually, you know, even though, like, if they're reading, say, the Gospels, which I think should be central for Christians, there's a lot of denunciations of hypocrites and, you know, people who don't actually do what they're supposed to do. That somehow doesn't get across, right?
Yeah.
You know, when somebody like starts spouting chapter and verse at me, the thing I always say is, how are you doing with the Sermon on the Mount? Are you implementing all of that?
Yeah.
Because if not, I don't really care what's going on in Leviticus, you know?
Yeah, exactly. With
So
what kind of hair shirt you need to wear and
yeah, I mean, and you can say that about any movement. I mean, think about all the namaste, would-be yogis out there
yeah.
who are fighting with each other to get out of the parking lot, after their yoga class and losing their temper.
Well, I've seen this with a lot of believers. Like, I think
Yeah,
any believer, like the one thing that belief does, I might be quoting Jonathan Haidt, but it blinds you to yourself. You start it forms blind spots if you're not very careful, like that
yeah.
accrual of focus, like it forms a blind spot, and you can grow all these bad habits and stuff that you never have to look at.
That's why, so that's something that you do see in all of these, let's call them intentional living traditions, right? Whether we're talking about philosophy like Platonic or Aristotelian or Stoic philosophy, even Epicurean philosophy to some degree, because they're a community, or if we're talking about religious movements, like Christian thought or or Indian thought, applied through. I mean, yoga is an actual philosophy. It's not just a bunch of exercises that you're doing. If you're doing the exercises and you're not actually, like, say, reading Patanjali, I don't take those people very seriously. But within every tradition like that, there's a couple things that help you avoid falling into that if you make use of them. Within the texts themselves, so the texts themselves are really the ancient authors speaking to us. There's a lot of warnings like that, and sometimes handy principles and practices that you can use to figure out your own bullshit and say, oh, I'm kind of falling down on the job. And then you should also have like a guide or a spiritual director. And of course they're fallible, they can screw up themselves. I've had plenty of people who I've had as a mentor, spiritual director, or therapist who weren't particularly good. But it's better to have somebody who can at least call you on some of your BS,
okay, yeah.
right?
Right, yeah.
And friends, I suppose, could fulfill a similar role if you're willing to hold each other accountable.
Yeah.
And so you have that within every tradition of intentional living. You look at monastic literature, and I'm pretty much only familiar with Christian monastic literature because I do a lot of work on St. Anselm. But I imagine there's similar stuff happening in Buddhism and in Hinduism and other communities. They're constantly having to sort out these human problems that you can't avoid, So that humility that you're talking about, that becomes something that you can't just take for granted. You have to continually engage in a process of self-scrutiny, and it helps to have somebody else who can look at it and say, well, you missed these blind spots,
Well, it also, being humble and then working against hypocrisy, it helps you to behave in a good way, I think, but it also might translate into how you think about things, and it might help to weed out inconsistencies in the way you think. And I bring this up to kind of segue into what I've been looking at with the college that I graduated from, Evergreen, and then a lot of other campus unrests, or there's a lot of campus activity that's going under the banner of social justice, or all these different names. And one of the things that I see happening is that these people are proclaiming or declaiming oppression, and what they want to institute is the most oppressive thing in order to get oppression out. Like I could give you an example of I don't want to get too heated of an example, but it's just like there's this constant hypocrisy where they're saying one thing or they're against one thing, and then they act like the anti-fascists, and it might be a low resolution image of these groups to only looking at the negative things. But I'm just wondering what you think about what's happening on campuses and free speech.
Well, I've been fortunate in that most of the places that I've taught, there's always some people like that. And that goes all the way back to when I was in college myself. I remember, people at Lakeland College up in, Howard's Grove in the sticks in Wisconsin, spouting some stuff, and I was like, like they'd say, "Who are you to judge anyone?" I said, "Who the hell are you to judge me on judging anyone?" So you had to do a little bit of verbal self-defense with that to begin with. And there's always trendy causes like that. But I've been mostly either coming up within or teaching within institutions where that hasn't been that big of a deal. I'll say that at Marist College, the faculty would often get on these rants themselves in this email forum that you couldn't unsubscribe from.
Ooh, yeah.
So, and eventually somebody would have to call them on it and say, listen, you're being uncivil here. And yeah, but I think in a lot of cases, there's always something like that going on. And it's unfortunate too, because there's legitimate concerns, right? So if you think about like Black Lives Matter, we really do have a problem here in the United States with policing being very heavily skewed against minorities, and a lot of here in Milwaukee, we're one of the most segregated cities in the United States, large cities. There's a lot of prosperity here that's not being shared with some of the areas. And so there's some real legitimate concerns. And then people will sometimes, it's like they're able to find an identity in that. And oftentimes, they're traumatized and then they become crusaders, and lose sight of the fact that they sooner or later, if you're in a political process, and I'm using political in a very broad sense here, not just talking about voting and stuff like that, but engaging to try to change society, you've got to actually be able to talk with other people and interact with them and build a community. You can't just batter them down or impose some new order. Although that's, I can totally understand why people want to do that. A lot of my research is focused on anger management, and and that comes in to that. And so, on campuses, you see a lot of that, and it tends to be from the left, right? And certain neighborhoods, you also see that, with people who have been, card-carrying Marxists since, they were radicalized back then. Usually they're pretty ineffective. And then on the right, you see plenty of that as well. We see a similar, I don't want to say, mirror image, but we see similar processes of people buying into something, some narrative about who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, and how somebody's going to come along and fix it.
Well, when we're presented with a story and when we're vulnerable, or let's say, and we're presented with a very powerful narrative. The narrative that I'm looking at basically breaks down into oppressor versus oppressed, which is a great thing. And it's such a powerful narrative that you can go around and see that in every single activity or facet of life and be able to do this kind of critical theory on the fly. So what are some of the things that people, some tools that we can have to resist or to introduce some drag into being swept up into these narratives, these really powerful narratives, without like ending up like I doubt everything, like mid-90s reality bites Ethan Hawke kind of person,
Yeah. The Cartesian who never comes out of Cartesian doubt sort of thing. Yeah. I think that, this is probably going to be difficult to get across to somebody who's already sort of like in full swing, but it's very important to maintain one's sort of networks of connections with people who aren't in the movement and who can, at least give you a weird look, or maybe sometimes say, wow, you're really going over the line, or wait a second, you're targeting me. I think a lot of people come under pressure to, once the world has been divided up like into the goods and the bads, the counter oppressors and the oppressors, right? It becomes, it's sort of cult-like, right? You should separate from all the people who don't buy into that narrative, often including your old friends and family. Yeah. Holding on to those things or restoring those connections is often important. And I know when I was tempted into buying into things, I was never really, I went through a Marxist phase, but I was like an actual Marxist, who thought organizing was important, and holding up signs is less important. That was fairly brief. But it was provoked by seeing how factories actually did work by working in one, up in Sheboygan Falls, and thinking these things through while reading Marx and other Marxists. Having people who could say, well, what about this? What about that? Giving you a richer worldview.
Yeah.
That's a good antidote. Having to actually spend time with them and eat with them and not having the luxury of being able to totally separate from them, that can be helpful. But, if you think about what a college campus does, it's set up to make that very difficult, right?
Well, not only on the level of the students, but the faculty too. They get into their departments and their social groups and stuff like that. And I mean, if you look at the data now, it's skewing more and more dramatically left, at least in the humanities. So that's a really difficult problem.
Well, and the social sciences too.
Social sciences too, yeah.
Yeah. And there's a wider social issue going on. It was interesting. I saw this play out at Fayetteville State University. So, the business community is kind of mixed, right? They're mostly interested in making money, but they also do want to have meaningful lives, and they do have to live somewhere. The people that you have to watch out for the most are sort of the corporate elite who don't have any commitments anywhere. Okay. But small business owners, you'd think they'd all be very conservative, and quite a few of them are, and some of them are sort of like, the card carrying, listening to AM radio, Trump never did anything wrong, sort of conservatives. But that's pretty few in my experience. A lot more of them are willing to hear things from multiple sides, but they don't want a lot of regulation. And they also don't like the fact that the colleges and universities are, doing a lot of indoctrination. They're doing crappy indoctrination because it's usually not very well organized.
What's crappy about the indoctrination? It's
just not very well run. I mean, if your goal is to get across a coherent leftist perspective to students, first of all, you wouldn't pick these professors to be the people to get it across, because a lot of them, are not people who the students are going to trust anyway. I mean, some of them are. Some of them can speak persuasively. Some of them are competent in their areas. But a lot of college professors, I wouldn't take classes from them as a student. And then, you got that. And they often contradict each other, right? What's happening in this sociology class doesn't match with what's going on in this philosophy class, because, we've got academic freedom. Yeah. And I think that's a good thing. I'm just saying that if they really wanted to do indoctrination well, they would need to be a lot more coordinated, and that would require, herding a lot of cats, for one thing. Professors often can't get along with each other. All you got to do is sit on a committee meeting and see how ineffective most professors are at coordinating activity. So it's less that there's some grand conspiracy out there, with cells and stuff like that, and it's more like there's a general culture that people participate in, and some of them are more vocal than others, and some students like to try this stuff on because they need something exciting, or they want to bash somebody, or they encounter some legitimate discrimination against them, and they're like, well, this makes sense of it. So anyway, the business community quite often and the academic community are often at odds with each other because they're not speaking the same language, and there's a sort of mutual distrust. And then you add on top of that the whole political level with parties that are largely dysfunctional, don't represent most of us, are hugely money driven by, coalitions of interests, and both have access to lots and lots of cultural institutions. That makes it a lot tougher. And there's really, for somebody who would like to be independent of that, there's not a lot of institutional space to go to. When I was down at Fayetteville State University, we were going through these massive budget cuts, right? Because it was the real beginning of the financial crisis hitting, where it mattered the most in terms of tax revenues in 2008, right? The crisis had started in 2007. roots of it go back further, but the writing was on the wall. Yeah. We're in deep trouble, right? So the state of North Carolina had a constitution that forbade them from borrowing money. And about 65% of the state budget either went to K through 12, community college, or UNC institutions. So, no money coming in, you got to make cuts. So the Republicans who control the legislature, they were like, oh, this is great. We can finally rein in those professors who've been giving us a hard time. So they went after Chapel Hill and UNC, which are, sort of the big flagship, sort of like what, UW-Madison and UW-Milwaukee would be here in Wisconsin. Yeah. They went after them. So the same thing's happening here in Wisconsin, by the way, under Scott Walker. And the Republican-controlled legislature. And then they also went after the HBCUs, the historically black colleges and universities, trying to cut them as much as possible, trying to look to close some of them. And a lot of this was political payback because the UNC system, heavily Democrat, the HBCUs, totally Democrat as far as leadership goes. And I was in the university senate at the time. And everyone was complaining about this. And I said, well, when are we sending a delegation up there? Because, it's just up the road to talk to these Republican legislators about the genuine needs that we have for educating students and continuing the mission. And everyone looked at me like I was crazy, except for the younger faculty. All the older faculty were like, they're never going to listen to you. And I was like, have you tried? Huh. Have you actually talked with the people that you think are totally opposed to you? Because if not, then maybe you should shut the hell up. I didn't say that, but they looked at me as if I was some sort of freak, and that was very telling for me. There's all these sides where people have these hardened attitudes, and they know everything about the people on the opposite side, and they don't go on to check if things are like that,
It seems like that's affecting negatively our country on a variety of levels, this hardening against each other.
Yeah, the polarization, or, the term that we would use in classical political theory, faction.
Yeah.
This is what Aristotle talks about. This is what Thomas Hobbes talks about. This is a real danger, I'm not saying that we're near civil war, because that's actually a good ways away. But over the last 20 years, what's that?
We're rather dysfunctional, though.
Yeah, we can't get anything done, and what we do get done is generally not for the common good. Mm-hmm. Almost all of our major decisions are now made entirely along party lines, and neither party represents the nation as a whole. Yeah. Yeah. They represent particular interests, and if you can easily align with the Republicans or the Democrats and what they stand for, it's great for you, Yeah. But for the rest of us, great example of this. We are the only nation in which the conservatives believe that global climate change is a hoax. Pretty much everywhere else, mm-hmm. You have a few fringe people who are like, yeah, I don't know about that, but almost everywhere else, the conservatives didn't buy into that poison pill. Our conservatives did, so we can't get anything done. Mm-hmm. And you can see the effects of it here. We used to be. I'll give you a trivial example. When I was a kid, we could cross-country ski here in Wisconsin pretty much the entire winter. Now you can't. Why not? We're just not getting that much snow. No, it's warmer here. We can see species invading the state that didn't live here before. Yeah. And if you live in a place like Canada, it's going to work out great for you. You can grow a ton of grain and sell it to everybody,
right. Yeah.
But for the military, and the Rand Corporation, they know global warming is taking place because they're already preparing all sorts of scenarios for it. Yeah. And the unrest that it's going to lead to. So we have all these really, really pressing problems, and we can't do much about it. Another great example is, both parties keep promising we're going to create more jobs. And given AI and robotics and the advances in logistics, we're going to have to figure out sooner or later, probably by the time that you and I are old, what the hell we're going to do when 50% of the population is unemployable.
Yeah.
What are we going to do with them? Are they just going to sit there and play video games? Maybe riot once in a while?
Right.
These are real issues,
Yeah.
and neither party is up to taking them seriously.
I mean, do you foresee that there needs to be some sort of like 2x4 to kind of wake us up, or do you think that there can be like a viral, just like open-hearted movement to like start talking across party lines and?
That's a good question. I mean, the party structures, I would say, make the second thing very difficult, because especially now, if you're seen as reaching across party lines, you're distrusted by members of your own party, and in primaries, you're probably going to be punished, right? The more extreme candidates tend to do a bit better. Unless, the DNC throws a lot of money or the RNC throws a lot of money at centrist candidates. And the RNC is not really doing that anymore. So I don't know how much prospect there is for that sort of thing. Is there some sort of 2x4 that could jar us out of this?
Shy of Civil War.
Well, I mean, I think it would take a while before we would get to something like civil war. I think what we're seeing instead is a lot of localized clashes, fortunately, most of which are just in words, at this time. But you can look around crowds and see, watch people's faces, see the people who are actually hopeful that what they're doing is going to bring some change, and then see the people who are just angry and hateful and are looking for somebody to blame, and would love, to get to throw a couple rocks or bash some heads in. Yeah. And you can find them on both sides. Yeah. I mean, I think we're also in a very bad way, like when it comes to all this Second Amendment stuff. The NRA has pretty much become a toxic element within our body politic, and the Republicans should wean themselves away from that. Because just 30 years ago, when I was growing up, the NRA was actually for gun control, and they could be reasonable about things. They weren't just tied in with these massive interests. And I'm not just picking on the NRA. I think NARAL and Planned Parenthood are just as toxic to the body politic as the NRA is. But the NRA definitely is toxic, seeing people like, at protests carrying military-grade weaponry around, and I'm a vet. I never like seeing any civilian carrying any military stuff. That's sort of a knee-jerk reaction on my part. So if I see some bubba with an AR-15, I want him deprived of it, because unless he's actually in a militia, run by the state, I don't want to see any of that. But to see people carrying this stuff around just to intimidate other people, I think it's disgusting. But that's become sort of normalized in our politics. I mean, that's criticism you can make of the right. There's equally, disgusting stuff happening on the left. And when I say disgusting, it's not just sort of a personal reaction. This is thinking as sort of like a political theorist. This is really bad for us.
Why? Could you explain that? Why that certain behaviors are bad for?
When people are allowed to engage in that sort of intimidation, I mean, it's just like when you have union thugs, and there's plenty of good union people, and then there's plenty of people who are thugs in unions too, and you can tell them apart when you've been in one for a while, or when you're from a union household, And my family, we've got a lot of people in the trades, and some of them are in the unions. When you see them being used at voting centers to intimidate people, I think that's terrible as well, and that's becoming okay for a lot of people, and that's where we're getting further and further along the lines of a society that's not just dysfunctional, that can't solve genuine political problems, but where we have very strongly established factions. And what we have to avoid is getting ourselves to the point of sort of a Hobbesian. Hobbes, he's famous for saying life outside of government is nasty, brutish, and short. What he's really, really concerned with is not some fictional state of nature. He's concerned about actually existing societies where the factions can't talk to each other, distrust each other, and are willing to start using force against each other.
Yeah.
And they do so first, he notices, through trying to co-opt the educational institutions or the preaching or this and that. Hobbes's remedy for that is have a very strong central government and let them decide everything. Not a great resolution for us, because who's going to be that figure, right?
Yeah.
Hobbes says, don't let scholarly controversies about the civil law promote faction. Just have one legal school, and by the way, get rid of all the Aristotle, the Cicero, because people who appeal to that sort of stuff, they're really causing trouble. That's not a workable solution. But he identifies the dilemma that we're starting to find ourselves within, and the situation where the different sides totally distrust each other.
Yeah, I think that the breakdown of communication, and then kind of something that you've hit on multiple times in this discussion about this this kind of radicalization, and the people who benefit in any institution are the outliers, like who are the strongest personalities and who have like the most radical views in any given institution, which swings these institutions further and further apart, and then and I just wonder how do we counteract that? Like I identify what you're talking about, and I'm looking at the stuff that you're talking about. I still have hope that I think it'll be more, health is more appealing than dysfunction, and it's the job of entertainers, thinkers, and people who produce content to make appealing the healthy stuff. And by healthy, I'm not talking about like quinoa or anything. I'm just talking about like being able to think through a problem, being able to like patiently listen to somebody who disagrees with you, and then like engage with them on a deeper discourse.
That's tough to do. I mean, we have sort of token representatives of that within, let's call it the entertainment industry, right? We'd always have shows like Crossfire, or these things, but they didn't get a lot of ratings, unfortunately. And they're not the norm, The norm is short pieces, either with like the, here's the two sides when there's probably like 8 or 9 that need to be represented. And each of them gets a certain thing, and it's usually skewed one way or the other. NPR is really good at that. They'll say, they have the perception of being balanced, but you can hear that the side that they like gets 30 seconds rather than the 15 seconds that the other side does, and they get the last word all the time. So I don't know. I mean, content producers, we have a lot that we could be doing. I don't know how we get into the entertainment industry, quite frankly.
Well, you're on YouTube, man.
Yeah, but there's YouTube famous, and then there's famous, right? And granted, some YouTube famous, like who's famous on YouTube? It's like the makeup tutorials and the game players and the weird, wacky channels that are promoting conspiracy theories.
Well, Jordan Peterson, he's breaking out a little bit.
Yeah, and it's kind of ruining him.
You think?
Oh yeah, I mean, I think he is now become kind of a prisoner of something you really have to watch out for as a public intellectual.
Yeah.
He's become a prisoner of his own success. You look at the Maps of Meaning, which was his main book before that. It's okay. It's not, the bits of it that I've read, I haven't been particularly. I didn't say, wow, this is an amazing intellectual or anything like that. A lot of people are sort of reading it backwards into that. How did he become famous? Basically by taking a stand against excessive social justice warriors. And I think as the right embraced him, he's kind of skewing further and further and further. And of course, if you're mostly having people telling you what a great guy you are for taking these stands, it's going to have a kind of corrosive influence unless you have an extremely strong character. Um, And those sort of things, I think, wind up being.
Well, again, that points back to like this. Anytime something gets concentrated power, that power starts. I guess corruption. It pushes something away from. I don't know if the center is the right metaphor or anything like that, or maybe flexibility would be a better metaphor.
Yeah, because I think that works because you end up becoming kind of, if we want to follow that, kind of ossified, right? You've got your line, you got to say it over and over again. I mean, the same thing happens. I do a lot of work on heavy metal in part because I'm a metalhead, and I do a lot of thinking about like what happened with certain bands and stuff like that.
Huh? Like a history and philosophy of heavy metal kind of thing.
Yeah, and that's it. I like the classical stuff, so that means like the 70s, 80s, some of the early 90s, not a lot of the genre stuff. So I'm not into, Scandinavian death metal or, all these little niches that people are really interested in exploring. But you think about, I was thinking about this the other day. What's it like to only sing this catalog of songs over and over and over and over again?
Yeah.
I think after a certain point, you'd be like, the crowd wants you to play this stuff, and you'd be like, man, I'd love to play a cover tune of somebody else.
Yeah, or just do a jazz album, just to break out from
some improvisation. Well, they did that in Spinal Tap. You've probably seen the movie. Do you remember when they break up and they're the two guys are pursuing their own thing and they're doing like jazz fusion stuff? Yeah.
Are they still wearing those tights when they're doing that?
Yeah, well, that was the costume back then. It was kind of de rigueur, and when you're a young guy, those sort of things are easy to wear,
So in order to like remain a moderate, you need to remain moderately successful. Do you think?
Oh, that's a good question too. If you're unsuccessful, I think there's going to be a tendency, unless you've got something to sort of stabilize your way of looking at things, there's going to be a tendency to look for somebody to blame for why you're unsuccessful. And so you could gravitate either to left or right, or to some weird, totally off the spectrum thing, conspiracy, cultish thing where they've got all the answers anyway. Because people do want to have answers, and they want to know that something is responsible for their lack of success. I mean, the other possibilities, you could just become depressed and blame yourself and
So unsuccessful is not good. You don't want to be unsuccessful.
Well, you don't always have a choice in that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I'll bring this back to something we were talking about at the start. So I feel bad for these grad students in philosophy who I see struggling in a terrible job market with a lot of disadvantages. So there are jobs out there. There's less proportionally than there used to be in my time, and my time was even tough. And unfortunately, the people from the top tier institutions suck up most of the jobs.
Yeah.
So there's not a lot left for those who are going to second tier or third tier institutions, who are often just as good, just as talented. You can get a great education. If you're self-motivated, you can get a great education anywhere there's a great research library. That was the case for me in Southern Illinois University. But that's not the way the market works. And so there aren't jobs for these kids. So what are they going to do? Should we encourage them to pursue, one-year positions here and there for the next 10 years until something comes open? That's a terrible way to live. You spend half of your time sort of like settling in and then applying for the next set of jobs. What if you want to have a spouse and kids? You're dragging them along with you. You burn out after a while. It's even worse if you try to cobble together 5-6 adjunct jobs that don't pay well and don't provide you with any benefits, unless you're really, really lucky and you get into a place that has a union. Trying to cobble those together, it's not a viable way to live. So what should they do? Should they say, oh, well, maybe I'll get a job doing something else. I'll find some way to transition this. There's a lot of people telling them, no, you've got that PhD. You should be staying within the field. And we're setting them up for failure.
Well, is it ethical of the institutions to be...
Oh, definitely not.
doing that? Pumping out these degrees?
There's ethical lapses across the field. Tenure track faculty should have been taking stands about this, because the writing has been on the wall for 15 years. They should have been taking stands about this rather than talking about, meritocracy. They should have realized that if they've got jobs, it's mostly luck and probably, a little bit of talent on their part, but mostly luck. And the people who didn't get them, they're probably as deserving of them as the others.
Yeah.
But they didn't do that. Administrators love having adjuncts because it's cheap. And, they've sort of boxed themselves into a corner. When there was a lot of money for education before the financial crisis, everyone built a lot of buildings and, started going to adjuncts. And now there's not as much money. So what are you going to do? Turn them all into tenure track jobs? It's not an option. Yeah. So administrators engaged in a lot of ethical lapses. The general public, not really caring about educational institutions, not paying attention to what was going on. They bear some responsibility as well, I think. Yeah. These parents who are totally surprised that their kids are being taught largely by adjuncts, they should have been, especially if they're alumni, they should have been paying attention to what was going on in their institution, and they didn't. So there's a lot of blame to apportion around. Yeah. So but the question is, who's going to fix it, though?
Or what trends will course correct it, whether that's a solution or not.
Yeah.
Fold in the institution. So, how do you perceive philosophy as important? This will be the last question, and this is probably a pretty big question. But how is philosophy practical for people who don't think of themselves as thinkers?
Okay. Well, within the history of philosophy, so I'm not going to talk about continental and analytic philosophy, but more the history of philosophy, the great thinkers that we encounter. When you look at not just the sort of thumbnail sketches of their work, but you read their works as a whole, you find a lot of them very concerned with the practical payout of their philosophical positions. And they think that, take Descartes, for example, right? Descartes puts forth this Cartesian method. You can apply that in all sorts of fields. As a matter of fact, in fields where people are being successful, sometimes it's because they're already using something kind of like that.
Okay.
So imagine you have them read that, you talk about it, you say, how are you doing this well? How are you doing it poorly? Where are you applying it? Where are you being inconsistent and not applying it? Where are the limits for this concept? Because you don't want to be saying that it's applicable to everything. You do that with philosophical concepts, and then you turn them into constructs that can be used in other fields, whether it's business and organizational management, growth, personal growth and self-help. Yeah. I actually work with a lot of psychotherapists, helping them produce actionable constructs that can be used in psychotherapy coming out of philosophy. And so, we've got this almost limitless field. And I'm not saying, by the way, that philosophy is the only place we can be doing this. Literature, history, they furnish us a lot of cool stuff. The social sciences have things to teach us. We should, in fact, if we're monkeying around with people's emotions, we should know something about psychology, as well as ancient, a theory of emotion or something like that. Yeah. But there's so much there that can be mined. Yeah. The trick is to be able to relate it to ordinary people. rather than saying, okay, so here's the really nice concept, and
Yeah.
I'm presenting it to you in a traditional academic way. Now you go run with it. Because then they're like, what the hell am I supposed to do with this?
Yeah, so philosophy is not only the models, but the ability to translate models into reality and maybe even identify models that are already at work and then be able to kind of go at those analytically, not in the analytical tradition, but think through things.
That's a nice way to put it. Ideally, that's what philosophy should be doing, which means that many of the people who call themselves philosophers are not philosophers in that sense. They're great at talking about this body of literature here that they've mastered, but doing the basic work of connecting it to other people's concerns, which, by the way, the great ancient, medieval, modern philosophers, they did that. Hume didn't make a living as a university professor. Descartes did for a little while, but that's not his main gig. Aristotle tells us in the Rhetoric that all teaching involves some persuasion, so you better learn how to do some of that. Machiavelli was moonlighting, working as a bureaucrat. A lot of these philosophers were very involved with ordinary life.
As opposed to academic.
Life. And even the ones who were, traditional academics, there's a reason why Hegel was the most popular lecturer in his time. Why Schopenhauer, when he tried to go head to head with him, lost. And it wasn't because the phenomenology of spirit is great. The phenomenology of spirit is very hard to figure out, right? You read Hegel's lectures; they're very clear. He could connect to his students well.
Why do you think that the clarity of Hegel didn't translate into his works, but was really present in his live?
Well, he didn't want it to. I mean, the philosophy of right, I would say, is more clear in the Encyclopedia Logic, but the phenomenology and the science of logic, they are, real head crackers.
And you think that they're that way by design?
Yes. Yeah, and he's not just being obscure for obscurity's sake. He thinks that you need to work through these in a very, complexly reflexive way. And I get it, but then being able to connect that, you just don't expect people to take the phenomenology and somehow immediately translate that to real life,
it's not the phenomenology of bread making; it's the phenomenology of spirit.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and so these people that try to reduce Hegel down to, well, he taught this thesis, antithesis, synthesis thing, and we'll apply it to bread making. Complete bullshit. That's not the case at all. A lot of the time in the phenomenology, it's not thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's a lot more complicated than that. He gets a little bit schematic like that in a lot of his other courses, his lectures, but even then, it's not as simplified as people like to make it. And quite frankly, I don't think that thesis, antithesis, synthesis, as far as philosophical concepts to then try to apply to reality, it's not a very good one in many respects. Most things don't fall so neatly into that kind of schema.
It's a very popular idea. Again, it's a catchy story. Once you look at the how does that map onto any given thing? It's well, it kind of is like that, but I don't know how much I'm working to translate this into this model rather than letting this model help me refine what I'm actually dealing with.